When the rain swept across the moors that November night, Hatherley Hall stood like a monument to sorrow. Its chimneys smoked faintly against the grey sky, and the long drive was slick with mud and fallen leaves. Inside, the house was too quiet. No laughter, no music, only the soft tick of the long case clock and the rustle of black skirts moving through the corridors. It had been 4 years since Lord Edward Hatherley was declared killed in action at Ypres. His widow, Lady Margaret, had worn mourning black ever since, and the servants had learned to move through the house as if in chapel. Every evening she lit a single candle in the upper window overlooking the moors. "For his soul," she would whisper, "and for England." None dared question her devotion. When Mrs. Charlotte Carter arrived as the new housekeeper that autumn, the staff looked at her with a mixture of pity and relief. A widow herself, she carried her grief quietly. Small frame, steady hands, and the kind of voice that soothed nervous maids. She came from Leeds, where the war had taken nearly every man on her street. The agency had told her only that Lady Hatherley was of refined character and not fond of change. From her first step inside the hall, Charlotte felt it, a tension behind the stillness, like a held breath. Mr. Gibbons, the butler, gave her a thin smile as he led her through the servants' passage. "Her ladyship keeps to herself," he said. "Routine is everything here." Meals served on the dot, shutters drawn before dusk, and— he paused, lowering his voice. "Never venture into the cellar." Charlotte frowned. Why ever not? Orders since the telegram came. The words meant little to her then. That first night, the storm worsened. The walls groaned with wind. Charlotte's small attic room shook under the rafters as she unpacked her belongings. A folded shawl, a Bible, and a photograph of her late husband, Arthur, whose body had never been found. She set the picture on the nightstand and whispered a prayer for both their souls. Then she heard it. A faint, deliberate knock from somewhere below. She froze. The wind howled, but the sound came again. 3 slow raps, steady and human. Pipes, she told herself. Old houses talk in storms. The next morning, while polishing the silver in the dining room, she mentioned it lightly. "Mr. Gibbons, I think something's loose in the cellar. I heard knocking last night." The butler went pale. "Best not speak of that, Mrs. Carter." "Surely it's just the wind." He glanced toward the door before answering. "Her ladyship keeps that door bolted. No one goes down there. Not since the war." Before Charlotte could ask why, Lady Margaret entered. She was still beautiful in the way marble statues are beautiful. Cold, perfect, untouchable. Her veil was pinned precisely, her black silk gown immaculate despite the hour. "What is this about the cellar?" she asked. "Nothing, my lady," Gibbons stammered. "A misunderstanding." Margaret's gaze turned to Charlotte. "Do you frighten easily, Mrs. Carter?" "I shouldn't think so, my lady." "Good. Then you'll know that Hatherley Hall keeps its ghosts where they belong, under lock and key." Her eyes lingered a moment too long before she swept from the room. That night, as Charlotte supervised the fires being banked, she noticed a curious thing. Lady Margaret had ordered a tray to be taken down to the old wine room, a pot of broth, a decanter of brandy, and a small loaf of bread. "For the chapel?" Charlotte asked. "For private devotion," Gibbons muttered, but his hands shook as he carried it. Later, unable to sleep, Charlotte crept down the servant stairs. The air grew colder as she neared the cellar corridor. A chain barred the heavy oak door, the keyhole sealed with dust. Yet faintly, very faintly, she smelled candle smoke. She pressed her ear to the wood. At first, nothing. Then, "Please, Water. The voice was hoarse, broken, and unmistakably male. Charlotte stumbled back, lantern trembling in her hand. The sound had come from beneath her feet, as if the very stones of Hatherley Hall were speaking. She turned and fled to her room, heart hammering. By morning she had convinced herself she'd dreamt it. But when she met the young scullery maid, Elsie Turner, scrubbing the flags near the pantry, she asked casually, "Has anyone been down to the cellar lately?" Elsie looked up sharply. "No one goes there, ma'am." "Not since the telegram." "What telegram?" "The one that said Lord Edward was dead." "Her ladyship shut it up that day. Cook says it's bad luck to even mention it." "Bad luck?" Elsie lowered her voice. "Cook swears she saw 2 teacups on her ladyship's tray once, though she'd only put one. Said she'd never known her ladyship to drink brandy before bed, until after he died." Charlotte frowned. "And you believe her?" Elsie hesitated. "I believe there's someone her ladyship still speaks to at night. Whether it's a spirit or not, that's for God to know." That evening, as twilight fell, Lady Margaret gathered the household in the hall. "The anniversary of my husband's death approaches," she announced. "There will be no deliveries, no visitors, and no letters accepted this week. We mourn in silence. Do you understand?" A murmur of assent passed through the staff. Charlotte bowed her head with the rest, but unease crept beneath her composure. After supper, she made her rounds. When she reached the corridor leading to the cellar, she stopped short. The chain was gone. Her pulse quickened. She raised her lantern and pushed the door open. The air beyond was thick with damp and something else. Something living. "Hello?" she called softly. From the darkness came the scrape of metal, then a cough. Rough, exhausted, undeniably human. Charlotte descended the steps one by one, the lantern's glow trembling across brick and barrel. "Who's there?" she whispered. A voice, barely audible. "Close the door. Please." Her breath caught. The figure crouched in the corner was gaunt, bearded, wrapped in a threadbare blanket. His eyes reflected the light like an animal's. "For the love of God," he said. "Don't scream." Charlotte lowered the lantern slowly. "Who are you?" He straightened, and in that moment she saw it. The resemblance to the portrait in the dining room, the strong jaw, the scar above his brow. He smiled faintly, a ghost of a man she'd only seen in oil and dust. "You already know," he said. "I am Edward Hatherley, and if she learns you've seen me, she'll kill us both." Thunder cracked overhead, shaking the old stones. Charlotte's voice trembled. "My lord, you're alive." He laughed bitterly. "Alive, yes, but not free." Not since the day I came home, Charlotte stood frozen in the doorway, the lantern's light trembling over Lord Edward's hollow face. His hands were blistered, his nails black with soot, his once fine features reduced to bone and shadow. "You shouldn't have come," he said again. "She'll know." "She, Lady Hatherley?" He nodded, grimacing as he shifted. "Aye. She locked me here 3 winters ago, said the world believed me dead, and it was better that way." Charlotte could barely breathe. But why? If you survived, why would she do such a thing? He gave a rasping laugh that ended in a cough. "Because I didn't die a hero. I deserted. The trenches broke men faster than bullets. I left my unit at Ypres and made it back across the channel like a rat. Thought she'd understand. Instead, she called me a coward and buried me alive in my own house." He leaned back against the damp wall, eyes half closed. "She feeds me just enough to keep me breathing. Says she can't risk the scandal of a living deserter. Better a widow than a traitor's wife." Charlotte's stomach turned. "This is monstrous." Monstrous, perhaps. But she's clever. She keeps the staff loyal with wages and fear. No one dares question her. And if I ever try to leave, she'll tell them I forced her to hide me, that I'm mad. A key rattled faintly above. Edward's eyes went wide. Go, he hissed. Now, up the side stair. If she finds you here. But before he could finish, footsteps echoed on the stone steps. Charlotte doused the lantern and slipped behind a stack of barrels. A door creaked. Light spilled down the stairwell, followed by the soft swish of silk. "Edward?" came Lady Margaret's voice, calm and cold. "You've eaten nothing again." Charlotte held her breath. Through a crack, she saw the widow's silhouette, veiled even now, a candle in one hand and a tray in the other. Edward's voice was faint. "I'm not hungry. Don't be foolish. You need your strength. For what? Another year in this tomb?" She set the tray down. "For my peace of mind." The silence stretched. Then she said softly, "They still send letters asking for your bravery to be commemorated. The War Office believes you saved 3 men before the trench collapsed. I prefer that story." Edward laughed bitterly. "You prefer the dead man." Margaret's tone hardened. "I prefer the one who doesn't shame me." Her footsteps retreated, the door closed, and the lock clicked into place. Charlotte waited until the echo faded, then slipped out, heart hammering. She climbed the narrow steps 2 at a time, burst into the corridor, and pressed herself against the wall. The storm had passed. Only the steady tick of the clock marked the hour. She crept back to her room, every nerve on edge. For the rest of the night, she stared at the ceiling, unable to reconcile what she'd seen. By morning, she had made a decision. She would confront Lady Margaret. When the breakfast tray was cleared, she knocked on the door of the widow's private parlour. "Enter," came the voice from within. Lady Margaret sat by the window, black veil lifted, sunlight falling across her sharp cheekbones. A stack of letters lay beside the untouched tea. "Mrs. Carter?" she said. "You're up early." "Yes, my lady." "There's something I must ask you." Margaret's lips curved faintly. "Ask, then." Charlotte steadied herself. "Why do you keep the cellar locked?" Margaret's eyes flicked up from her teacup. "Because it's full of rot and vermin." "Why do you ask?" "I heard something there." A man's voice. The silence that followed was suffocating. Margaret set down her cup with exquisite care. "I see. And what did this voice say?" "Please, water." The widow regarded her for a long moment. "Fear can play cruel tricks, Mrs. Carter. This house has many echoes. I'm not mistaken." Margaret rose. "Then let me make myself clear. You were hired to maintain order, not to chase phantoms. Should I find you prying into matters above your station, I will have you dismissed without reference. Is that understood?" Charlotte's throat tightened. "Yes, my lady." "Good." Margaret returned to her seat. "Now go and see that the west windows are cleaned before luncheon. The glass must be spotless for the anniversary tomorrow." Charlotte curtsied and withdrew, but her resolve only hardened. That evening, she slipped into the butler's pantry, while Mr. Gibbons tallied the wine. "Mr. Gibbons," she said softly, "has anyone ever seen the late Lord's body?" He frowned. "Of course not. He was buried in France." "And who told you that?" "Her ladyship herself." "And you never questioned it?" Gibbons's face went white. "Mind your words, Mrs. Carter." "We serve, we don't inquire." He turned away, but his trembling hands betrayed him. Later that night, Charlotte waited until the household slept. The wind had died. The moon shone through broken clouds. She took the spare key from the butler's drawer, a master key she'd noticed earlier, and crept toward the cellar once more. Halfway down the stairs, she heard a faint clatter, then Edward's hoarse whisper. "I told you not to come back." "I had to," she said. "You can't stay down here." "It's inhuman." He smiled weakly. "Humanity died long before I did." Charlotte knelt beside him, offering a flask of water she'd hidden beneath her shawl. He drank greedily, eyes closing in relief. "She keeps you alive only to preserve the lie," Charlotte said. "You could escape. There are trains to the coast. You could disappear." He looked at her as though she'd spoken nonsense. "And leave her to answer for it? She'd sooner burn this house to the ground than let me walk free." A sound above them made them both start. A door slamming, hurried footsteps, the creak of the stair. "She's coming," Edward whispered. Charlotte darted behind the barrels again as light flared on the wall. Margaret descended swiftly, candle held high, her expression sharp as a blade. "I know someone's been here," she said coldly. "The chain was moved." Edward said nothing. Margaret's gaze swept the room, then landed on the half-empty flask. She snatched it up, sniffed it, and her lips thinned. "You've had company." Still silence. "Very well," she said at last. "If she means to play saviour, she'll learn what salvation costs." She turned on her heel and climbed the stairs, the lock snapping behind her. When the footsteps faded, Charlotte emerged, shaken. "She knows." Edward met her eyes, hollow with despair. "Then it's already too late." For the next 2 days, the house lived under a peculiar silence. Lady Margaret's temper, once distant and cold, turned almost gracious. She praised Charlotte's diligence, asked about her health, even invited her to tea. But the sudden kindness rang false, like a smile painted on glass. Charlotte knew she was being watched. Every step she took was shadowed by the soft tread of the footman. Every corridor seemed to hold an unseen ear. The cellar door, once left ajar, was now double-locked and sealed with a new chain. Yet at night she still heard faint tapping from below, not summoning, but warning. On the third evening, as she polished the silver in the dining room, Lady Margaret entered with 2 teacups and a pot of jasmine. "Sit," she said. "We should talk, Mrs. Carter." Charlotte obeyed, though her hands trembled. "You've been a great help to me," Margaret began, her voice smooth as silk. "The household runs more efficiently than it has in years." "Thank you, my lady." "And yet," the widow continued, "I sense a disturbance. You've been restless." Distracted, Charlotte forced a smile. "It's only the adjustment to country air." Margaret's eyes glinted. "Of course." "And to dark cellars, perhaps?" The words hit like ice. Charlotte set her teacup down carefully. "My lady, You were seen," Margaret said softly. "Mr. Gibbons noticed your lamp missing the night before last." "You have a curious nature, Mrs. Carter. That can be dangerous in this house." Silence filled the room like smoke. Then Margaret leaned forward. "Tell me what you saw." Charlotte's throat tightened. "Nothing, my lady." "Lies." Margaret's tone sharpened. "You think me a monster? You think I enjoy keeping a man locked away like some animal?" Charlotte swallowed. "If you know it's wrong, why continue?" "Because I have no choice." The outburst shocked them both. Margaret rose abruptly, turning toward the window. Outside, the moors rolled beneath a bruised sky. "Do you think I wanted this?" she said, quieter now. "He deserted. Fled his post. Had the army discovered him alive, we'd have lost everything. The estate, the title, my name. I did what I had to do." Charlotte stood, heart pounding. "You buried the truth to save appearances." Margaret turned, eyes flashing. You speak of truth as if it feeds a household. I've kept 40 souls under this roof clothed and paid through war and ruin. I will not let one man's weakness destroy them. The door opened suddenly. Elsie stood there, pale as linen. My lady, she stammered, there's someone at the gate. From the War Office, Margaret's expression changed instantly. Send him to the study. And Mrs. Carter, remain. When the girl left, Margaret's composure cracked just enough for Charlotte to glimpse the fear beneath. They've found something, she whispered. They wouldn't come otherwise. Moments later, a man in uniform was shown in, a captain, mud-stained from travel, cap in hand. Lady Hatherley, he said with a stiff bow, forgive the intrusion. I come regarding your late husband. Margaret's smile was practiced. My husband has been gone these 4 years, Captain. That's what troubles us, my lady. His identification tags were recovered in a trench outside Ypres, alongside a body we can't identify. Some believe it might be him. Charlotte nearly spoke, but caught herself. Margaret's hand tightened on the armrest. Impossible. He was buried long ago. We have no record of it, my lady. The War Office would like confirmation from you personally, for official closure. I see. Her tone turned syrupy, dangerous. You will have it by post tomorrow. Good evening, Captain. The man hesitated, sensing he'd been dismissed, then bowed and left. When the door shut, Margaret turned to Charlotte. Do you see now? One whisper of doubt, and the edifice collapses. Charlotte steadied herself. It doesn't have to. You can end this. Margaret gave a hollow laugh. End it? By revealing that Lord Hatherley cowers beneath my feet like a criminal. No, Mrs. Carter. There are things in this world that cannot be brought into daylight without rotting the very air. That night, Charlotte could not rest. The image of Edward, gaunt, hopeless, haunted her. She rose, wrapped herself in her shawl, and crept once more to the cellar passage. The new chain was thick, but she'd taken a small saw from the tool shed. Each pull of the blade rasped like a heartbeat. Finally, the last link gave way. She slipped inside. The air was colder than before, the candle she'd brought flickering violently. Edward? She whispered. No answer. She descended the steps. The cot was empty, the blanket gone. Panic rose in her throat. She turned in circles, the light dancing over the stone walls, and stopped. A smear of blood near the drain. A broken glass. Charlotte. She whirled around. Edward stood in the shadows, weak but upright, his eyes fierce. She knows you came back. I don't care, she said. We're leaving. He shook his head. You don't understand. She told me she'd kill herself if I tried again. Said the scandal would outlive us both. Footsteps echoed from above. She's coming, Edward breathed. Hide. Charlotte darted behind a pillar as the door opened. Lady Margaret appeared, lantern in hand, the light throwing her pale face into harsh relief. So, she said, voice trembling with fury, the saviour returns. Edward stepped forward. Let her go, Margaret. She's ruined everything. I ruined everything years ago, he said quietly. You're just trying to bury the pieces. Margaret's face twisted. You deserted your men. You left them to die. I kept your secret because I pitied you. But now? Now they'll know what kind of coward you are. She raised the lantern as if to strike him. Charlotte lunged from the shadows, grabbing her wrist. Stop! The lantern slipped, shattered, and fire bloomed across the floor. The straw caught instantly. Smoke filled the room. Edward pulled Charlotte toward the stairs. Margaret coughed, stumbling backward. Leave me, she cried. Not again, Edward said, and dragged her with them as flames licked the walls. They burst into the courtyard, gasping for air. The cellar door collapsed behind them with a roar of sparks. Margaret fell to her knees, clutching her chest. You fool, she wheezed. Now the whole house will know. Edward knelt beside her. Then let them. From the servants' windows came cries of alarm. Gibbons and Elsie ran out, buckets in hand. Charlotte shouted for water, for blankets, for help. By dawn, the fire was out. The cellar was a blackened shell. Lady Margaret sat wrapped in a blanket, silent as stone. Edward, gaunt but alive, stood beside her. When the butler approached, she lifted her head. Mr. Gibbons, she said softly, summon the village constable. Tell him my husband has returned. Charlotte met her gaze, expecting hatred. But in Lady Margaret's eyes there was only exhaustion, and something that looked almost like relief. By morning, word had spread through the estate like wildfire. The servants moved in frightened silence, glancing toward the charred doorway that led down to what had once been the cellar. Smoke still rose in pale ribbons through the broken stones. Lady Margaret Hatherley sat in the drawing-room, a shawl draped around her shoulders, staring at nothing. Her face, so often composed into porcelain dignity, was drawn and colourless. Across from her stood Captain Harrow, the War Office man who had visited 2 days earlier. I must say, my lady, he began stiffly, this is most irregular. To conceal a man presumed dead. Margaret cut him off with a faint, icy smile. Presumed dead is not the same as dead, Captain. My husband's cowardice was the true death in this family. I merely arranged the burial. Charlotte flinched at the cruelty of it, but Edward said nothing. He sat by the window, wrapped in a borrowed coat, his face half in shadow. The captain cleared his throat. You understand this constitutes both deception and obstruction of military inquiry. I understand I preserved my household from disgrace, Margaret replied. Edward's voice broke through the tension, quiet, bitter. And me from sunlight? Harrow turned to him. Lord Hatherley, if that's truly who you are, your case will have to be reviewed by a military tribunal. Desertion is still a serious offence. Edward met his gaze steadily. Then I'll face it. But not here. Not as her secret anymore. The captain nodded, almost respectfully. I'll arrange your statement. You'll remain confined to the house until I return with orders. When he left, the silence that followed was heavier than before. Ogarius slowly and crossed to the fireplace. You think confession is noble, Edward, she said quietly, but you don't understand what comes next. The world will not forgive you. It will mock me. The estate will be seized, the staff turned out. They will not hang you, but they will starve us all. Edward's eyes softened, but his tone was firm. Then let it. I can't live another day pretending to be a ghost. You already are a ghost, she cried. A coward who crawled home when better men bled out in the mud. She turned toward Charlotte, trembling. And you, what have you done, Mrs. Carter? You've ruined everything I built. Charlotte met her gaze calmly. You built it on lies, my lady. Lies can't stand forever. Margaret swayed slightly, clutching the mantel for balance. The firelight flickered across her pale face, illuminating both fury and despair. Tell me, she whispered, do you think the world will thank you for your righteousness? Do you think they will understand? Charlotte's voice wavered, but she did not back down. No, but at least I'll understand myself. Margaret's lips parted as if to speak, then closed again. She turned away, shoulders trembling. That evening, The manor felt suspended between two worlds, half in ruin, half in revelation. The servants whispered that judgment had come at last for the Hatherleys. Edward sat in the study, a candle burning beside the half-burned ledger that had once kept the estate's accounts. Charlotte stood by the door. "You should rest," she said. "I've rested enough for a lifetime." "You'll have to tell them everything tomorrow." "I will," he said. "But there's something I must do first." He opened a drawer and took out a small envelope sealed in red wax. "My will," he said, "written before the war. It leaves the estate to my wife, under the assumption that she would keep it in trust should I fall. But she kept me instead." He looked up at Charlotte, eyes hollow. "She deserves to keep the house, but not the story. I'll give them that truth, even if it kills me." Charlotte hesitated. "And what of her?" Edward sighed. "I loved her once. That's punishment enough down the hall." A sudden crash echoed, porcelain shattering. They rushed toward the drawing room. Lady Margaret was on the floor beside the table, a glass of brandy spilled at her feet, her hand clutching her chest. Charlotte dropped to her knees. "My lady." "Breathe, please." Margaret's eyes fluttered open. "Tell him," she gasped. Edward knelt beside her. "I'm here. Tell them I—" Her words caught. "I only wanted to protect what was ours." Edward's hand shook as he pressed hers. "You did what you thought was right." "No," she whispered. "What I thought was necessary." Her eyes fixed on the candlelight above them, then dimmed. Charlotte felt the pulse fade beneath her fingers. Edward bowed his head. "She's gone." The house seemed to exhale, a long, weary breath that had been held for years. Later, the captain returned to find Lady Margaret dead and the cellar in ruins. He listened to Edward's confession in silence, wrote a few curt lines, and left with the promise that a statement would suffice in place of trial. Whether out of mercy or political convenience, no charges were brought. The war had made too many ghosts to exhume another. The estate, however, was another matter. Debts long hidden under Margaret's management surfaced. Creditors circled. Within months, Hatherley Hall was to be sold. Charlotte found Edward one morning in the chapel, kneeling beside the cold altar. "You'll have nothing left if you stay," she said softly. He smiled faintly. "Nothing left is still more than I deserve." She placed a hand on his shoulder. "You could start again." Somewhere far from here he looked up at her, eyes tired but clearer than she'd ever seen them. "And you?" "I've no home but work. But I'll remember this place, and what truth costs." Outside, the moors were greening again after the long winter. A pair of crows wheeled above the ruined courtyard where the fire had burned. Edward stood, taking one last look at the house that had been both his cradle and his prison. "I once thought dying in war was the worst fate a man could meet," he said quietly. "But I learned there are slower ways to bury yourself." Charlotte followed his gaze. "And now?" "Now," he said. "I mean to live." The war had ended long ago, and so had Hatherley Hall. Its windows stood empty now, ivy curling through the cracks, the gardens gone wild. The grand drive where carriages once gleamed was little more than a path of moss and stone. In a modest cottage at the edge of the village lived Charlotte Carter, older now, hair silvered and hands marked by time. She kept house for the parish vicar and taught the local girls to read in the evenings. Few knew the name she'd once carried, or the house she had once tended. Fewer still remembered the scandal that had flickered briefly and faded like a candle in the wind. But some nights, when the sky turned violet over the moors, she still dreamed of the sound beneath the floorboards, that first desperate knock calling her toward truth. She had not seen Edward Hatherley in nearly 15 years. After his release, he had sold what little remained of the estate and vanished north, rumoured to have found work as a groundskeeper on another man's land. Sometimes letters came, short, careful ones written in a soldier's hand. "The heather's in bloom again." I remember the smell from the courtyard. Then, one spring, they stopped altogether. Now, in the spring of 1935, the postman brought her a single envelope stamped with the War Office crest. Her fingers trembled as she broke the seal. "To Mrs. Charlotte Carter, it is our sad duty to inform you that Edward Hatherley, formerly of Hatherley Hall, has passed away at his residence in Northumberland. In accordance with his will, the enclosed letter is to be delivered to you personally." Inside was a smaller envelope, yellowed and sealed with the faint impression of red wax. She hesitated, then opened it. "My dear Charlotte, if this reaches you, then I am at last where peace cannot be taken from me. I have lived quietly, without name or title, but never without memory. You once told me that truth has a cost. You were right, but so does silence. I paid mine gladly when I saw what freedom looked like in your eyes the night you opened that door. There is one request I ask of you now. Visit the hall once more. Not for me, but for what was left behind. In the west chapel, beneath the broken floor, you'll find a small tin box. Inside are the last papers that bear our names. Her letters, my confession, and the deed to the land. I have signed them all to you. Let what remains belong to the only person who ever set me free. E. Hatherley. Charlotte read the letter twice, the ink blurring through her tears. Then she packed a shawl, a lantern, and set out across the moors. The wind was gentle that evening, and the heather glowed like fading embers in the twilight. When she reached the gates of Hatherley Hall, the iron creaked under her hand, as if the house itself remembered her. Inside, the air was cool and still. Dust lay thick on the marble floor, but the great staircase still curved upward in quiet grace. She walked through the corridors where laughter had died, past the parlour where Margaret's voice once ruled, and finally to the old chapel. The roof had partially fallen, and moonlight streamed through the broken rafters like pale silk. Charlotte knelt by the cracked altar and pried loose a piece of the flagstone. Beneath it lay a small tin box, rusted but intact. Inside were 3 items. A folded confession written in Edward's unmistakable hand. A bundle of letters tied with a black ribbon, Margaret's handwriting on each. And a small brass key engraved with a single word, freedom. Charlotte smiled through her tears. "You found it after all," she whispered. She sat there for a long while, reading by lantern light. Margaret's letters were not cold or cruel as Charlotte had expected, but full of conflict, guilt, fear, love, twisted by pride. One ended with words that seemed to echo across the years. "If I cannot be forgiven, then let forgiveness live somewhere beyond me." Charlotte replaced the papers carefully, then rose and looked around the chapel. The yew trees outside swayed in the wind, their branches brushing the windows like the breath of the past. She took the lantern and climbed the staircase to the great hall. For a moment, she stood where the chandeliers had once hung, where laughter had once echoed. Then, with slow and steady hands, she lit a single candle and placed it on the window ledge, just as Margaret had done every year for her lost husband. The flame wavered, then steadied. Outside, the first drops of rain began to fall. The candlelight flickered through the cracked glass, casting faint reflections across the moors. A signal, perhaps, to no one at all, or to the souls who had once lived here. Charlotte whispered to the empty hall, "He's free now." And so am I. As she turned to leave, she caught sight of something on the grand staircase, faint footprints in the dust, leading upward. For a heartbeat, she thought she was imagining them, but they were too sharp, too recent. She followed them to the landing where a single portrait still hung. Lady Margaret Hatherley, painted in her prime, her dark eyes watching from another century. The candlelight caught the gilt frame and turned it to gold. Charlotte reached out, touched the edge of the frame, and smiled. "Rest now, my lady," she said softly. "The truth has kept its promise." Outside, dawn broke across the hills, pale, cleansing light spreading over the ruins. The wind carried the scent of wet heather through the open doors, and for the first time in decades, Hatherley Hall no longer seemed haunted. As she walked down the path, Charlotte looked back once. The candle still burned in the upper window, a single steady flame against the morning sky. In its glow, the house no longer looked like a tomb, but something gentler, a monument not to shame, but to the fragile mercy that comes when the living finally tell the dead they can rest. And though no one else would ever know it, that light became a legend in the village. On quiet nights, travellers swore they could still see it burning, a widow's candle that never went out, shining for the truth she'd uncovered and the souls she'd set free.